to allow me to share my screen and start the recording. Recording has started. Right. Can I just confirm that everybody can see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we're coming to the end of the academic writing month, and we've spent the whole month looking at different parts of an article or parts of a thesis. We started off by looking at the introduction and looking at how we start posing the argument in the introduction of a paper. We then went on to looking at how to present methods and how to present results. So far, we've taken it quite slowly, but so far you can see a lot of the thought has been focused in the introductory section. The method section, hopefully you've done the thinking on that when you were doing your protocol. So much of that could have been copied and pasted from your protocol and just turned into a flowing prose in your article. You didn't have to do a lot more new thinking. And then with your results, you have had to take the results that you've worked with your co-authors, the statistician, the tables, the graphs, etc., install them into the section called results, and then just write something about them without going further into the interpretation. So today we're going to look at bringing all of this together. How are we going to bring the results together and link it to the introduction, bring back the argument? We're going to look at that today. Next week, we're going to look at the abstract, the title, the style of writing, and selecting the journal. So today we're going to finish off the draft of the article itself. So let's just go back to 3 weeks ago when we started going through the paper. And remember that it was in the introduction that we posed our research question. And in the introduction, we also gave some background. We provided a context for where our research was going to be placed. In the methods, you went into how you are going to discover the answer to that question, and you did it in such a way that other people who want to do similar work would be able to copycat you. And then clearly the results speak for themselves. But the discussion is what brings the entire story together again. It answers the question that you posed during in the introduction. It's going to be where you're going to instate your own interpretation of the results and how they will impact on the practice. You will go into explaining the implications of your results, and you're also going to support your answer with literature. You're going to look at the current knowledge, and you're going to suggest where your research will lead to. I would argue that the discussion is possibly the most important part of the paper, because that's where it shows your depth of thought. It shows that you're contributing something new to the body of science. So I believe that you should take a lot of time to get it right. You can write it and rewrite it. And I'm going to go through a guideline with you where you can do bullet points for various parts of the discussion. And then later, as you develop it, you turn it into a more flowing prose. But I'm going to give you a recipe for making sure you get all the elements in that you should into your discussion. I also want you to remember that editors are often very busy people, and they might read your abstract and decide to take your article on board for review or not based on that. They might read your introduction. They might read your entire discussion. They might just read the last paragraph of your discussion before they decide to send it out for review amongst their own reviewers or not. So we've got to remember that we are playing a game here. We are wanting our work to be published. Not only do we want it to make a difference, but we want it to get published. So we have to make sure that if we're going to have somebody who's going to be a limited reader, we're going to pick up and make sure we've got the most important information where they are likely to be reading. So you'll remember that I went through this diagram with you when we looked at the introduction. We looked at the general structure of an IMRAD article, which is what we're working towards. Remember, an IMRAD article is the traditional format for a quantitative or positivist type publication. As soon as you start looking at qualitative work, the format can be slightly different. From the introduction, we covered that. Study site here, we would have covered that in methods and results. That is what you have done. So in the introduction, we started from talking about broad concepts and narrowing down to where you are going to be doing your research. Now what we're going to do in the discussion is we're taking your results, we're going to discuss them in the context of your work, and we're going to build it out to see how broad the impact of your research can be. In this diagram, it also has conclusions as a separate entity. I usually say that discussion includes conclusions, but sometimes, depending on what you're writing and how the flow of your work has gone, it might be a good idea to have an entirely separate section underneath your discussion that is called conclusions. And that is, you'll decide that for yourself. You'll see how your paper goes. You'll see, is your conclusion stand out enough as it is in the discussion, or do you want to pull it out and give it its own platform? So having a look at the discussion in broad strokes, what we're going to look at, what does your research mean? And so what? What have you achieved? You explain the results, your objectives, the limitations, implications for future research, etc. So this is where we are fitting our work. But let's look at the same diagram and look at our argument. Remember, in the beginning, I said we put our claim, warrant, evidence, backup, rebuttal, qualifications, all of that goes in your introduction as well. You are providing your evidence in the results section, but when you come back to the discussion, you are again going back to your argument. It's like you're standing up in court again, and this is your closing argument. This is where you are showing how, after your opening statement, you've got all your witnesses out there, you've got all your evidence, and now this is your closing argument, and you're going to bring back your claim, warrant, evidence, backup, rebuttal, qualifications, etc. So looking at this diagram, you can see why an editor is likely to read your intro and discussion and leave the rest out, because he's looking for depth of thought, novelty of research, does it fit in with his journal, etc. But also you can see where you have to apply your mind incredibly deeply, and why I suggest you take time to write your discussion. I would say that your discussion should take at least half the time of writing your article. And I also believe that you cannot really write an article in one day. You can write the outline, but every day as you go through this, after a couple of weeks, your own thoughts gel differently, and you continue reading in your work, that after sitting with your first draft for a couple of weeks and you keep going back to it, you're going to find that the quality of your thought in your discussion is definitely going to deepen. So let's just look at a couple of guidelines. The one question everybody asks is, how long should this be? And if you recall, I only gave you a word limit for introduction. And there's a reason I do that. I give you a very small word count, 600 words usually, depending on the length of the article. So if you've got a 3,000 word word count from the journal you're writing for, I would suggest you only use 600 words for your introduction. And people freak about that, because they want to put so much in the introduction, especially a novice writer. They want to go and quote everybody that they've read. They want to almost do an entire literature review, which is appropriate in some forms of research, but not in the kind that we're talking about now. Your methods and results, the length of those sections has to be enough to merely make your point, so that hopefully by the time you get to discussion, you have a lot of the word count balance left. Hopefully you have as much as a third or even half, so that you can really go into depth about what your research means for practice. So I have said that this is arguably the most important section of your paper, because it is here where you are going to expose your new knowledge and how it fits into the world. You state, you support, you explain, and you defend your answers to your research questions, and you will discuss important and relative issues. But having said that, I want you to keep a lot of your words for this section. To make sure that your argument is clear, you have to be succinct. There is no space for verbosity. So you try to write as succinctly as possible to get your message across. That's the important part here. It's not how many words you have to waffle around. It's how many words you need to get your message across. So let's get practical now. It seems to make sense to write the discussion very much like we wrote essays at school, a beginning, a middle, an end. And let's break it up to see what should be in those sections. And these are not 3 paragraphs, these are 3 sections. So the beginning can be 1 paragraph, your end can be 1 or 2 paragraphs, and your middle can be several paragraphs, depending on how you are going to present your work. Right, for your first paragraph, you want to answer your research question exactly as you asked it. So in the example of Antoinette's work that I used last time, her research question was, does my regimen of steroids and IVIGs work as well, if not better, in patients with SJS and 10 as the alternative regimen, which includes debridement of wounds? So just out of a thumbsuck, my first paragraph, I've written it down, I'll show it to you now, but to answer that question as it's asked, I would be saying here, in this paper, we have shown that corticosteroids and IVIGs do have a success rate in patients with SJ and 10, possibly better than with debridement or burn treatment. So that's kind of where we go. And that link is, what was my research question? Here is the answer. It's as explicit as that. And when you're making your notes, just make it as explicit as that in your first draft. If it reads like a bit of a staccato afterwards, you can always go back, but make it as explicit as that. So let's look at what she actually wrote. This is what got published. This retrospective cohort study has shown that the use of systemic corticosteroids together with IVIGs for the treatment of SJS and 10s in HIV patients resulted in a high survival rate compared to the previous report, which had a mortality rate that was high. We observed that CD4 counts and SCORE10 score did not impact mortality rate in HIV patients. So that's her first paragraph. It answered her question without ambiguity. So that's paragraph 1 done. It's explicit. You don't want to hide it in lots of fairy tale words. You come straight out with it. Right, now the middle, you can break up into how you feel you would best produce it. Sometimes you've got a series of sub-questions, and then I suggest each one has its own paragraph. But these are the 9 things that you consider when you're writing the body of the discussion section. You're going to support your answer with your data and data from others if appropriate. So in the case of the SJS10 patients, she's already supported it by saying, these are her figures. I had a 97% survival rate. The other regimen has a 30% mortality rate. She also goes on in the body to say, look at all these other studies that people did. They also had a very high mortality rate when they were treating SJS10 as a burn, for example. One of the things that's very difficult for some people to do is avoiding redundancy with the results section or discussing results in the results section. It's very difficult when you first start writing to write about a result and not talk about it, or write about a result and not give it. So what I'm trying to say is in this particular study that we're discussing, in the results section, it will have, there was a 30% more, a 97% survival rate. That's it. So in the discussion section, she's going to say her 95% survival rate was achieved because, and then she can go on to show that she's got a whole lot of science behind why that regimen worked. She will also go on to say that patients were exposed to steroids, HIV positive patients were exposed to steroids in other pathologies. And if it's acute, it's fine. So she's not just jumping to conclusions and doing her own thing. She has been backed up by the science. Go on to say what your results mean and matching results sections to discussion paragraphs. So if in your results, you've got various sections, like some of the results are to do with gender, other results are to do with blood counts, further results are to do with various pathologies. You would actually break those up and discuss the meanings of each of those separately in the discussion section. Explain how your findings, your answer fits into known situations. So going back to the SJS study, what Antoinette could show was that in other cases, steroids were given to HIV patients in an for acute treatment, and they did not end up having the problems that the people who don't like this treatment anticipate that there should be. So she's established earlier on in the paper that there is some form of controversy around this, and she fits it into her known situations. But let's look at another type of study. What if somebody was looking at Down syndrome and they were looking at the kinds of treatments available for specific things that Down syndrome children suffer from? So how would they explain how the answer fits into known situations? They can state that Down syndrome children are placed across the province. They don't all have access to clinics, that the specialized services are all centralized, etc. So they can talk about the current situation. Let's think of another study, for example. What about a study on people's perceptions of insomnia? What do we know about insomnia? If I come up with an answer that says that more women suffer from insomnia than men suffer from insomnia, then you might be able to go into a discussion, if it's backed by your research, about women worrying about work and home and family, and they have a lot more items that they worry about, whereas men might worry more intensely on work and supporting the family, but not necessarily worried about the fights between the toddlers. so that explain how these findings come into the situation you know about, but always back it up. Don't just make this up. I'm making it up now as an example. In order for the flow of your article to work, you should be linking up to statements that you made in your introduction. And it should be quite easy because you've put your argument out in the introduction and you're coming back to your argument. So you'll be saying things almost as explicitly as I said above, this is what is happening here, and this is how my results change it. So when you're making your notes, you can write it in as childlike a way as that, so that you can make sure that you are going to refer to your introduction in order that your results, to relate your results to your research question and your argument. You should be able to defend your results and explain any discrepancies with published results. And this came through in Antoinette's paper. Her results come through that with steroids, she treats SJN10 successfully. People don't die as badly as much as they do on others. She has to defend her stance because people say you can't give steroids to somebody who's HIV positive. She defends that in her article. And she will go in and look at articles, more articles than are in the introduction, or even refer to the same ones that are in the introduction again. Explain why some data do not support the data if you find out. So this is basically finding if you find confounders. So looking at a study on insomnia, for example, if I was to look at women's perception of insomnia, and I did a focus group on a group where there is not the language that describes insomnia. So say, for example, I have got a focus group of isiZulu speaking women, and I asked them about insomnia. They don't have a word that describes that. They would interpret lack of sleep as just worrying at night, something that's very different. So you're going to have to be very aware of times when your data is not going to fall exactly the way you like it. So we've got a student who is looking at insomnia, and this has come up. So if you have a group of first language English speaking people, they will be able to respond to questions on insomnia. If you have a group that are not English speaking and their language does not have an equivalent word for insomnia, or even a concept. So the concept of insomnia means I can't sleep. For some, a sleepless night is I didn't sleep because I'm worried. It's subtly different. You've got to be aware of that. That is a confounder, and you've got to be able to explain that. Another point that's important is sometimes you start seeing a trend in your data, but it might not be statistically significant. And I've got a pet hate for everybody who just bows to the almighty P equals 0.05. That is a very good guideline. And in a novel drug, I would look for that. But if I have a study that says there was no significance, no mortality significance of this drug at all, there was a P equals 0.09, I would question that. I would say, if the P value is 0.09, it's a pretty convincing move towards that there is some mortality. Maybe if we repeat the study, get more patients on it, up the dose, whatever. So start discussing that. So if your study comes up with P equals 0.09, you can say there's a trend here. We weren't able to show statistical significance in this study, but maybe future work should be geared towards that. And then another thing to include in the body of your work is to explain the validity of the assumptions that your methods are based on. There is no such thing as a perfect study. I'm sorry to say that. That bursts a lot of people's bubble. They think science is perfect science. It isn't. Every single study has got some assumption that we make, and we should be very aware of it. And the big one is looking at retrospective data. Retrospective data, doing a study on retrospective data is a valid way of doing your research, but there are going to be holes in it. And we are going to make assumptions on that data. And we must be clear about that sometimes things aren't all as they seem. But as long as you're honest, as long as scientific integrity comes through, that's fine. As long as you highlight any assumptions that you make. So for example, if you're going to be doing focus groups discussion, you're going to assume that everybody in your group is going to understand your questionnaire the same way, that they'll all have to give you the same type of answer. That might not be so. You might find that people in your group have a completely different perception. So you've got to say, I've got one single questionnaire, and I'm assuming that everybody is going to be capable of answering this particular questionnaire from the same platform. Okay, so that's the body. So you can see a lot goes into that. So if you're going to be spending time writing your discussion, you could write half a page almost on each one of these. And also bear in mind that there are some studies that are designed in such a way that not all 9 of these are relevant. And also there might be others that are relevant that I haven't put here, that I haven't thought of for this talk. But while you're making your notes for your discussion, just make bullet point notes for each of these points, and then you've got the entire mass of information that you need to create the prose for the middle of your discussion. Right, so then we come to the end. Now the end is not necessarily just one paragraph. I would leave the last paragraph for that golden message. That message that if your editor is only going to read one paragraph, it's that one. So I preserve that final paragraph for the most important message. But let's look at what else gets put in towards the end of your discussion. It's good at this point, now that you've discussed the context, you've defended, you've argued your points through your discussion, it's good to be quite explicit about how your work is novel, about how much you are adding new knowledge to the body of science. And you can do that in a couple of sentences, a paragraph, maybe one sentence. But whatever you do, make sure that you put your work on its pedestal in this section here. Suggest practical applications of your findings. I mean, it's easy in Antoinette's paper. The practical applications is why treat patients with SJSN10 in the burns unit when you get a much better result as far as even mortality is concerned, let alone morbidity, if you use corticosteroids. Costs is another thing. What are the cost implications of anything you've researched? What's going to happen in terms of workflow? How is your research going to be important going forward? How's it going to change things for the better? You'll also explain any limitations or weaknesses in your study design, but don't apologize for them. Everybody knows there's no such thing as a perfect study. Just show that you are aware that there are limitations to as far as you can take this new knowledge that you've generated. Just be honest. Just say, this was a retrospective chart review. Are there normal things that happen with it? There's missing data, etc. But don't be obsequious about it. Your work that you've done is valuable. It cannot be 100%. just show that you are aware of it, but don't be apologetic. You don't have to be. Suggest further research. The thing about suggesting further research shows that you really are mentally engaged in your work. You know where you are in this. You know where things can go forward. You know where the whole science has come from. So it shows that you've intellectually truly engaged with your research question and know exactly where it's going to be fitting in. And then again, to emphasize, the last paragraph should summarize your principal take-home message. And again, it's because we want that emphasis to be there for, firstly, the editor, and secondly, your average reader who tries to get, if they're looking to do a literature review, probably are only reading those sections of the paper anyway. And that last paragraph will probably also occur as the conclusion in your abstract. So that's the 3 parts. There's quite a lot that goes into it. So that is just talking about a paper now. So let's have a look now at a thesis, because the discussion of a thesis is very similar to a discussion of a paper. And let's talk about a thesis. You might end up with an examiner who literally is going to read the opening chapter of your thesis, flip through the rest of the thesis and see that your pages, your papers have all been published, and read your conclusion. It's a possibility. And in the 20 PhDs that I've seen done, I think that has happened more than once. So the most important part that shows doctorateness would be your introduction and your conclusion. So I always tell my students, as they're putting their thesis together, imagine that the examiner is only going to look at those 2 sections. In those 2 sections, you have to show your doctorateness through and through. And we've gone through what is doctorateness before. And we have to make sure that you see that this is occurring in this thesis in those sections. So clearly, again, your introduction is going to pose your argument, and the discussion is going to close your argument. So the principles are very much the same as they would be outlined for a paper. So the last chapter of your thesis will show what your studies have contributed and why that contribution is innovative and shows doctorateness. This is no time to be overly humble. Arrogance is also not appreciated, but put everything into this chapter that, using those guidelines that we've given at the top, that show that you have achieved doctorateness. It should show this logical thread through your papers that create the story. And that story is what links each of those chapters. And in my students' work, each chapter has a paragraph that shows how it links to the previous chapter and how it's going to link to the next one. So the story often gets written in those paragraphs between each paper and comes together in the discussion. And here's a really important quote, is this chapter is where you critically examine all your papers or chapters in the light of the previous state of the subject. So what was before, so your literature review, as outlined in the background, and make judgments as to what has been learned in your work. The page limit is always asked, just like word count. The page limit for a conclusions chapter is as long as it needs to be. But some people don't like that answer. So I'd say at least 5 pages. Remember this thing. If you have got a lazy examiner, they're going to look at your introduction and they're going to look at your conclusion. So do not underestimate the importance of those 2 chapters, but particularly do not underestimate the importance of your conclusion. Right, so what are the things that would have to be in your chapter? You're going to consolidate all your chapters here in relation to your research. So, for example, if you've been looking at cleft lip and palate, the genetics of cleft lip and palate, You're going to look at how many studies, what did whole exome sequencing bring in, how much next generation sequencing bring in, what was the epidemiology, create the story, consolidate, and then show how your work has provided the new science. Again, have a clearly defined substructure. So I would say that for each paper that you have published, you discuss it here in relation to the bigger question, but do not repeat. Do not do the same thing. I said, don't create a redundancy. It needs to synthesize your chapters. I've spoken about that. Make sure the golden thread goes through. And it also needs to demonstrate that you understand the limitations of your research and the implications. You should also highlight future research. Remember, you might want to do a postdoc. Think about what would a postdoc do and what gaps are remaining that you could not cover. And it needs to follow your chapters and also keep referring to your scoping review or your literature review. I always like a scoping review, but also make sure you've got new, more recent research quoted in your discussion. Just to give you an idea of where literature should be included, if I was to look at a thesis that starts with an introduction and then a scoping review as the literature review and consecutive papers, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes you change the order of the papers and a discussion. I would like to see the literature and the scoping review changes, ends at the date of the first or second year of research. Then all the papers that happen consecutively after that include some of that research, but more updated research. And then by the time you get to the final discussion chapter, literature as recent as the weeks before should be included. So that goes back to my statement I've made very often that a literature review isn't a once-off thing. It's an engagement with the literature on a daily or weekly basis to make sure that you keep up to date, that you keep referring to the most recent data, literature data, and that your research stays current as you move through it. And that is all I have to present to you. I can now field some questions and offer you any more anecdotes should you require them. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see everybody. So, anybody have any questions or comments? How many people have already written the discussion section to their thesis and have got tips? Elliot, I see your hand is up. No, it's not up. It's my cursor. Sorry. There are no questions. Has this talk given you some ideas as to where to start? I try to make things almost baby step simple to start. I do this myself. I get an A4 page and I put my 9 points down and I make bullet points. I know some people have said it's a bit puerile, but that way I can make sure that my stuff is complete, that I have the complete set of data there. Richard, have you got any comments? Do you want to talk about the conference next week?
Yes, thanks, Colleen. Firstly, that was an excellent talk, and I really have nothing to add to it. I really just want to really confirm everything you say. Trusted their own results, that they wrote the discussion as though they had actually found the opposite of what they did, because it was more in line with what conventional thinking was. Obviously, that's entirely inappropriate. You must how you wish they might have been or think they could have been or anything like that. And as you said, Colin, just to remind people that we are having our what we've called candidates conference next week. The idea is that we'll have a special section on Monday afternoon at 3:30. I'll do that with Colin's help. Where we just give hints and advice on how to present a paper at a meeting. You know, an 8 or 10-minute oral presentation. The people who attend that, I'll ask if there'll be some people who volunteer to make such a presentation on their work and present it online on Zoom on the Wednesday or Thursday afternoon. If there's enough interest, we'll do the 2 afternoons. If there's not quite that much interest, we'll do the 1 afternoon. And the point is, it's not that we are so much interested in what you have to say. It's not a scientific conference. It's mainly to advise you on how appropriately or how well your presentation came across. So it doesn't matter if your research is finished and you have results, or if you're halfway through it, or if you're only devising your protocol. I'll give some idea on Monday how any of those could be worked up into a presentation. But we'll be speaking on things like how well you stick to time, how well you covered your subjects, whether your slides looked appropriate, and all of that sort of thing. And the last thing to say is that nobody need be embarrassed. No, we'll be doing it very delicately and sensitively. If there really is anything that we really think you ought to know that might be a little embarrassing to say out loud, well, then we'll get hold of you separately and have a word. So I really hope that as many as possible will join us on Monday afternoon at 3:30 for the little introductory section, some hints on how to present, and that at least a few of you will have the courage to come online on Wednesday or Thursday and actually give us an 8 to 10-minute presentation. And obviously, those who are not presenting would very much like to be online to listen in, to learn, and even to provide their own feedback. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I think I'd like to reiterate what Prof. Hefter said, is that this is a nurturing environment. We are not here to make people feel humiliated. We are here to help you to achieve your best, and we are here to nurture you. Pax, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Prof, for the excellent presentation. It clarified most of my questions. So I wanted to ask about if you have a lot of more than one research question you answer in your discussion, do you have to, and you've got maybe other secondary questions that you're trying to answer, so your primary outcome measure and the secondary ones, do you have to explicitly in one paragraph explain or give your results there, or you can do it in different paragraphs? If I'm not sure whether you understand me correctly.
I think you've got to try and put yourself in the shoes of the reader. And if you've got clear paragraphs going through your work, you're going to make it easier for your reader. And next week, I'll talk about having one idea per sentence, one concept per paragraph. So say, for example, you're looking at 3 different aspects of a research question. What you would do is you'd make sure that in your introduction, you talk about them in a specific order. In your methods, you talk about the methods for the first one, the second one, the third one, in that order. You present your results in exactly the same order. And when you get to the discussion, you present them either in single paragraphs per concept or groups of paragraphs, but you do it in that order so that you can keep this thread going all the way through in the same order, else you're going to confuse your reader. So just remember that I always try and think when I write something, I don't want to be patronizing. So I always think, if I write this, will my father understand it? So my father is not a clinical specialist, but he's intelligent enough to read these things and he can make sense of it. So when I write it, it must be simple enough that somebody who does not understand this work will understand my work. Somebody who does not have an understanding of this topic will understand my work. And so I believe in breaking things down into paragraphs helps do just that.
All right. No, thank you so much for that, because although I'm still writing my papers and I also review papers for our local journal. And I find that when I review papers from like junior registrars or from elsewhere, I found that the discussion is all over the place and you can't make out where the research question has been answered, and you find that and then when I give back my reviews, I found that sometimes I'll have to say things like that, because you do find that in some very junior writers, you find everything all over the place. So I think that's very, very useful for us to as reviewers as well to learn from it.
I think that's a very important point you make, Pax, is reviewing other people's work is incredibly important for your own learning. And another thing I say, and I don't know if Lufunda is here in the audience, is when you do review a paper like that, just remember that very often those writers have been thrown in the deep end. They've just been told, go off and write. They've not been coached. They've not had the privilege of courses. They've not had a Doctoral Academy or anything else. So whatever you do, make sure that your response is kind, firstly, and then also help them, build them. Just share, this is what it should look like. Lufunda is here. Lufunda, would you like to comment on reviewing as part of a learning process and how much you learn from reviewing for your own writing?
Yes, Prof. Am I clear? Am I clear enough, Prof?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm talking through the speakers of the car. Yeah, it was very interesting. Actually, the first time I reviewed and I called Prof, I remember her looking at me and saying, you know, sometimes these things you just have to be a little bit kind and remember that these people might be very good reviewers or very good writers later on. Because sometimes things just look not in line. And that teaches you something, actually. It teaches you humility. It teaches you how to interact with people. And even my own papers, sometimes they shambok you left, right, and center. But it's actually a very good learning process. The things you get from reviewing other people, then you put yourself in the shoes of those other people and see how it applies to you. But then, obviously, because of that, then I had to attend 2 reviewer courses, which, of course, I think they were probably the best thing I did for myself in terms of reviewing. So it's a lot of things. Sometimes you just think this is just ridiculous. There's no way this person can write like this. But obviously, when you look at the other side, a lot of reviewers might not even be in your field. And just 2 days ago, was it yesterday, I was talking to you, Prof, if you remember, and I was saying some of these reviewers look like they actually know nothing. And then Prof Nina actually commented that that's the whole point. The point is you have to drive your ideas across enough so that the layman and anybody can understand in the simplest forms. And I think it was a very good statement from the Prof. It's been a nice journey. And I would encourage actually people here to accept reviewing these articles. You see through a lot of your own shortcomings, and the learning that happens from there is brilliant. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thanks for that comment. I think the word I was struggling to find earlier about any critique that you send back in a review is constructive. Be constructive in your criticism. Never allow yourself to make a destructive statement to anybody. You don't know what you might be crushing. Elliot, I see your hands up. Would you like to make a comment?
Yes, this is just a comment regarding reviewing. What I think is that when you do the review, it's important that your mind must be, you mustn't be tired. I think it's important to, because I remember sometimes I read through somebody's paper, and maybe I don't get a good sense of this paper. But when I read it again, maybe when my mind is fresh and then I apply myself, then I totally find it very, very interesting. And then I learned from that, maybe fatigue may also have an impact on what on your response as a reviewer.
That's
It's like
absolutely true. Yeah. But the flip side of that, Elliot, is that when we are writing, we must be very aware that the editor or the examiner is also going to be pretty tired. And so we must be writing in such a way that even if somebody is half engaged with your work, you pull them in, hopefully.
Yes.
You
Yes.
can't create miracles.
Thanks, Prof.
Okay, Lafunda, your hand is up. Did you want to make another comment?
Yes, Prof. The other thing I actually learned from that reviewing process and from those short courses I attended is that you need to be very honest with yourself as a reviewer, as you're reviewing a paper, in what you do and what you cannot do. It doesn't mean that when a paper is thrown to you for review, you have to review everything about it. Sometimes, actually, you have to be true to yourself and say, I'm going to review these sections and these sections because I'm confident and I know what I'm talking about. Because sometimes we actually struggle as reviewers because you're trying to force something that you are struggling to understand. And in the process, you end up doing the wrong thing. So what I learned then was, if you are not very confident with statistics, you can invite your friend or other reviewers that you know to help you in that regard. Sometimes you can actually just send it back and say, for these sections, I would like somebody else to do it. It's something I didn't know before, but I learned much later on. Obviously, the fatigue is a big thing, and any time it's like writing a paper. If you're tired, it's sometimes just doesn't work. You need to take breaks and things like that. So I really appreciate the previous comment. So that's what I wanted to just add.
Thanks for that. I think you are right that we can ask advice on a paper, but be very careful. You must be aware of the confidentiality clause on the article that you're going to be reviewing. It might say it's not to be shared with anyone, in which case you say, okay, I believe that I've reviewed these sections, but I cannot review the statistics, and you just give it back to the editor like that, rather than go and find somebody who will assist you in getting your head around the statistics. Yeah. Richard, I see there are quite a few comments about Monday. Would you like to refer to them? Just clarify some of these questions.
Right. Let's have a look. Is there a presentation by next Monday? Not. What does Dushima mean by that? Is Dushima here? Gababo? Bahabo? Just to explain what you mean.
She is here. Dushima, would you like to unmute and just explain what you're asking?
Am I right if I read that to say that you mean, must you have a presentation ready by Monday? If so, the answer is no. because we'll give advice on Monday as to how you might like to do it. So if you've got one, that's great.
Hello, Doshima is here. Hello.
Hi,
Hello,
Doshima.
Doshima.
Yeah. Okay, so sorry. I thought I heard Prof say he will explain some points better by Monday. So I was wondering if there will be another discussion on Monday. That's what I was going to clarify. Hello, can anyone hear
Yeah,
me?
we can hear you.
Okay. So I was asking if Prof, in answering some questions, was referring to Monday, saying I'm going to explain this better by Monday. So I was wondering if we were going to have a similar discussion by coming Monday.
Okay. By the way, everybody, just put my dates right. Next Wednesday is the writing afternoon again. Our conference is on Thursday and if necessary on Friday. So there's no competition on the Wednesday. No, so nobody has to do anything and there'll be nothing before next Monday. But on next Monday afternoon at 3:30, Colin and I will just need a brief discussion on how to put together a good presentation for a research meeting. And then we'll be inviting people to come up with their own one by Thursday. So they'll have 2 or 3 days to do it. And then to present that to everybody, to receive feedback. And we've promised it'll be constructive, nurturing, and supportive feedback. And we won't be humiliating or embarrassing everybody for having done anything wrong.
Good. Lafunda, is your hand still up from the last time? Or you very eagerly want to make another point before I close?
Oh, sorry, Prof. I'll put it down. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. So next week, we will have the final talk on writing. We're going to look at the abstract, your title, how to find a journal, writing style, etc. And then we're also going to have separately the session for those of you who want to learn how to do presentations and practice presentation. I think you all know by now the Doctoral Academy is made up of 3 arms. The Tuesday arm is kind of a supportive role. The Wednesday arm is a how-to type role. And then we have these other ad hoc courses that are more extensive than we can give in one Wednesday session, or practice sessions like presenting to an audience. So thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you next week. And the person had asked if there'd be a link. Yes, we will send you a link to join us for the presentation workshops in next week. So just keep an eye open for in your emails. Thanks everybody for attending. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.